Hello. This videocast is about Hitler's approach to government. It's part of the A-level specification. I'm obviously specifically recording it for my own teaching group, although general listeners will hopefully get some benefit from it as well. So we will push on. Just a reminder to my class that last lesson I gave you the chapter 3 from Kershaw's book, The Hitler Myth, and that there are two YouTube videos in which I walk and talk you through my own notes to that chapter. The links are on the slideshow, which you can, which forms the basis of this videocast. You can download that from the usual Padlet area. Alternatively, if you go to my YouTube channel, Jay Malone, and go to playlists, you'll see both of those YouTube videos in the playlist called Germany 1933-34 Nazi Consolidation of Power. Just the context of this particular topic, Hitler's approach to government, in your booklet of possible essay questions for Depth Study 3. As you can see, there are 16 essays there listed, but I've highlighted for you the following, highlighted them in yellow for you, and they're all listed there. So you get a sort of sense of the type of Section B questions that can come up in which you're asked to talk about Hitler's style of leadership and the impact that that style had on Nazi Germany between 1933 and 1935. Okay. The usual rule when you're playing these videos, you obviously can pause at any point, so I won't, as a general rule, read to you from what you can actually see, because at any point just pause the video so you can read through yourself. Again, there's the big picture, so you can see that we're getting towards the end of Depth Study 3. And in terms of the follow-up reading, you'll have seen from the previous slide there, two sources in particular. You've got also three sources. The first of those was the Kershaw that I've already mentioned. Then you've got Stephen Lee in his book Hitler and Nazi Germany. There are two essay questions, two essays that he's written in chapter 3 of his book. The first was, how was Germany governed between 1933 and 1939? The second is, how effective was the Nazi political system? I really can't emphasize how strongly enough how important it is that you read those two essays. To help you, I'll upload my own notes to those essays to the Padlet page for this lesson. So you could, but make sure you read the original essay as well. The scan of that chapter will be on the Padlet page. Those are the two questions. And then also for each of those two Stephen Lee essays, I have written Quizlets that give you factual recall questions for facts that are in those chapters. and also, as you can see, I have recorded a YouTube video for each of those essays in which I walk and talk you through my own notes to those essays. They're not massively long videos. The first one, how was Germany governed between 1933 and 39, is 15 minutes long, and the second, how effective was the Nazi political system, is 16 minutes long. The QR codes there give you access to those videos, or alternatively, again, go to my playlist area and you'll see they are in the playlist Germany 1933-39 Nazi policies. There are 48 videos in there. Two of those 48 videos are those two Stephen Lee walkthroughs. and an excellent chapter at the start of volume 2. It's only a short chapter, 16 pages, called The Nazi Political System from Noakes and Pridham's Documentary Reader, the second volume, State, Economy and Society. So again, I'll put a scanned copy of that chapter onto the Padlet page so you can download and read it. It really is an excellent chapter, so make sure you pick up on that with your stretch reading for this particular topic. I gave you a mind map last lesson, so you get a sense of the stages of this particular lesson, starting with the uniqueness of the Nazi system and, as always, working our way around clockwise from that point. Okay, so those are the key strands, and finishing with cumulative radicalization. You've actually got a choice here, so you've got the hard copy of that. So in the course of the next the course of this video, you pause and you can make notes around the edge of that particular mind map. Also, I have made a traditional looking mind map with exactly the same strands: uniqueness, leadership style, polycracy, outcome chaos, Führer's will and cumulative radicalization, but with the strands going off there. I didn't give you a hard copy of that one, but if you wanted to download it from the Padlet page, print it off, put it onto an A3 sheet of paper, or you can stick together two A4 sheets, so it gives you plenty of space around the edge to make notes as you play the remainder of this video. Okay, so I think we're now ready to start. So we'll begin with that first strand, the uniqueness of the Nazi system and the debate. So we'll get into the history now. Okay, and those are the three sort of key questions for you to think about as we go through this. First of all, why was it understandable that the early generation of historians writing in the 1950s misinterpreted the Nazi regime to be what we call a monocratic system? Okay, so we'll pick up on that one, and then how the accepted viewpoint amongst historians today has moved away from monocracy to what we call polycracy, a polycratic system. What does that mean? And then the third question, in spite of its chaotic structures, there's much evidence that the Nazi regime was still efficient and achieved many of its goals. Why was this? Okay, so have those three questions in your mind as we go through this first strand. So there's the strand. Okay, so you can see those 3 points: 1950s, monocratic, chaos, polycracy, and efficiency in spite of chaos. Okay, so let's start off with the 1950s. I mean, for many years in the 1950s and 1960s, historians assumed that Hitler approached government in a centralized fashion, claiming numerous orders that had to be implemented by a subservient party that had taken over all state institutions, i.e. a monocratic system. So, okay, what exactly do we mean by that? If you look at the the pictures here, this first diagram sort of represents simplistically. On the left, you've got that sort of notion of Hitler, what Hitler became. In 1933, Hitler became the leader of the state. Now, over here, ever since 1920, Hitler had been leader of the Nazi Party, and the Nazi Party was a pyramid structured organisation whose task was to win Hitler votes, to win votes for the party. It was the vehicle for Hitler to get himself elected into office. And once Hitler was in office, he suddenly found he was the chancellor, and he was now leader of the state. Now, the state, another word for the state is the civil service. It is the machinery of government. The people who are who work for the state, teachers, policemen, civil servants, whatever, they are not party members. They are servants of the country, and it is their job to implement the laws that are passed by the leader of the country. So you've got those sort of two pyramids. Now, the traditional sort of interpretation after World War II, certainly for the first 15 years or so, was this. And so I'm just going to pan over to the right-hand side. And what I've represented there, as you can see, the argument is that the Nazi Party basically took over the running of the state. So you imagine the party took over the key positions in the state. So one pyramid neatly took over the running of the other pyramid. So you've got a state structure, the machinery of government, and all the key positions in the state were taken over by the party. Okay, so the argument is that after 1933, you've got Hitler, the leader of the party, and Hitler, the leader of the state, and the party has taken over the running of the state. Okay, all looks very, very neat. And the viewpoint, the word monocratic, mono means one. Okay, so basically you've got one leader, Adolf Hitler, and beneath Adolf Hitler, you've got a perfectly oiled machine. The state, the apparatus, the machinery of government is being run by the party. And there's Hitler at the top giving orders. So clearly the implication is one leader, one system, a well-oiled machine. It is an image of a very orderly form of government, is the argument here. Now, this was the accepted interpretation by historians for the first 15 or 20 years after the end of World War II. And if you think about it, you can understand why historians developed this interpretation. After all, the image of Nazi Germany, think about the sort of propaganda image that Hitler put across throughout the 1930s and the 1940s, was one of a very efficient dictatorship. You've got the dictator at the top, and whatever Hitler wanted to happen, happened. Everybody was working together to follow the orders of Adolf Hitler, the dictator of Germany. So the whole image of the Third Reich under Hitler's leadership was one of efficiency. And that seemed to be borne out by fact, because the regime, the Nazi regime, apparently up to a point achieved a huge amount. I mean, Hitler created a dictatorship. Hitler solved the economic problems caused by the Great Depression. So he resolved the issue of unemployment. He created jobs. He got the economy moving again. He rearmed Germany. Foreign policy moved in a relentless direction according to Hitler's will. And then in 1939, Hitler launched his eastward expansion, ultimately looking for living space in the East when he invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. All of this is what Hitler apparently wanted, and what he wanted happened. So therefore, logically, Hitler was very powerful and was running a very, very efficient state. Okay, so there, in a nutshell, is the monocratic interpretation of the Third Reich. Now, that interpretation was pretty much accepted, written by most historians throughout the 1950s and into the early 1960s. But once we move into the early 1960s, then the interpretation started to change. And this is where we move into what we call the polycratic interpretation. Okay, so new evidence began to appear that contradicted the accepted monocratic interpretation of government. And the new evidence that started to appear in the 1960s didn't quite seem to fit with this image of a very efficient Third Reich. because the new evidence was in fact that the opposite was the case. Okay, the opposite was the case. So if we look at this diagram here, okay, so you've got the same sort of two triangles. Now remember, with the monocratic interpretation, basically the party represented in brown there, the NSDAP, neatly took over the running of the civil service, the state, okay, which is represented by blue. But actually what this diagram shows is that that didn't really happen, okay. And this is the new evidence that began to appear from the 1960s. And what historians actually began to learn is that Hitler only allowed the party to partially take over the running of the civil service, only partially, okay? Only in key areas of policy did he allow that to happen. Areas that mattered, that were of immediate importance. So, for example, policing. Yeah, the party took over the running of the police. Okay, so that was, in fact, was the SS took over the running of the police. Yes, that happened. The media. Yes, there was pretty much a full takeover. Now we've done all of this. It's what we call Gleichschaltung. But again, think about what you already know. Think about the Night of the Long Knives. Hitler called a halt to the takeover. He called a halt to the coordination. So, for example, he didn't allow the army to be taken over by the SA. Now, it was the same with the civil service. Hitler only allowed the party to partly, and that's kind of like the overlap area there, represented there, he only allowed the party to partially take over the running of the civil service. Why? Well, because the civil service was staffed by experts. They may not have been Nazis, but they were educated professionals who were doing a good job. Their job was to be the machinery of government. And from Hitler's point of view, the party members lacked the experience to run the country. So what historians learned in the 1960s is that, unlike, for example, the Russian Revolution, where the party, the Bolshevik party, the Communist Party, completely took over the running of the state, unlike the Chinese Revolution of 1949, where the Communist Party completely took over the running of the state, actually, Nazi Germany was different. There was not a full revolution. There was only a partial takeover by the party of the running of the state. So, that therefore is the basis of what we call polycracy. Remember, monocracy means there's one system sitting beneath Hitler. Well, actually, if we look at the Third Reich, pulling back a little bit here, you can see there's Hitler at the top. And beneath Hitler, throughout the whole of the 12 years of the Third Reich, there were two separate systems. He continued to be the leader of the Nazi Party, and that basically meant he had to work through an office called the Party Chancellery. That office was led by a man called Martin Bormann, okay, who was kind of like the secretary. So members of the Nazi Party, to get access to Hitler, had to go through Martin Bormann, who led the Party Chancellery. So the Nazi Party were radicals. They were believers in Nazi ideology. Many of them had joined the party in the 1920s. The role of the party had been to win votes for the Nazis. And Hitler was the leader of the Nazi Party. But then suddenly, in 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. And the Chancellor, of course, was the Prime Minister, the main minister within a cabinet of ministers. And a minister was the person who was in charge of a ministry. So the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Defence. And the ministries are what we call the state, okay? The ministries are the permanent machinery of government, the civil servants who are responsible for running the country. And so Hitler suddenly found himself as the head of government, And as head of government, his job was to sit in the cabinet, and his job was to talk to the ministers, and the minister's job was to talk to the civil servants that staffed their ministries. So the civil servants here, hundreds of thousands of civil servants, they were not members of the Nazi Party. They kept their jobs. It came, governments may come and go through elections, but the civil servants stayed the same. And you know a little bit about that anyway. We've already said that traditionally in the Weimar Republic, the civil servants were usually drawn from the same old families, particularly the Prussian Junkers. That was a sort of like a legacy of the Second Reich. And the Eber-Gruner Pact, where that sort of continued through into the Weimar era. So civil servants were the professionals, they were the experts, they drafted the laws, and the civil servants would communicate to the Chancellor and his ministers through an office called the Reich Chancellery, which was a building in Berlin. And the Reich, the person in charge of the Reich Chancellery, and we'll do more about him in a minute, was a man called Hans Lammers. So Hitler put a Nazi in charge of running the Reich Chancellery, but the people who reported to the Reich Chancellery were not Nazis, they were the civil servants. So that is, they are our power structures. Okay. Add to that, you've got other structures. You've got the SS. Okay, I've represented that in brown. You've got the SA, okay, that lost their leadership in 1934. Then you've got the army, okay. So what you've actually got here is a sort of picture of Hitler, the leader of Germany, with enormous powers, but beneath Hitler, you've actually got a mess of many, many different organisations. So the old image of a single machine working towards Hitler that was very, very efficient. What surprised historians was actually you've got one leader but many different organisations that are not necessarily all working together as one, and Hitler sitting above them all. And that was not a recipe really for efficiency. So it opened up a whole new debate. Why then was the Third Reich so successful if it was outwardly such a mess of many different structures sitting beneath Hitler? Okay, so again, you can pause through, but as we go through, but these are the key points. It doesn't mean, though, that the system was inefficient just because you've got polycracy or incapable of reaching its goals. This is what's debated. Okay, so some historians, and these are the historians that we would actually call the intentionalist historians, and I've given you the names of some of those historians there. Okay, some historians argue that in spite of the apparent chaos of all these different organisations, polycracy, that Hitler continued to be very much in control. Okay, and so this viewpoint is what we call intentionalism. On the other hand, there are other historians, and we call these the structuralist historians, and there are the names of them there, Brotzat, Mommsen, and Kershaw included, who would argue that actually what this shows is that Hitler was not as strong as we previously thought, that actually Hitler, although he was a dictator, was a relatively weak dictator, certainly in comparison to, say, Stalin in Russia or Mao in China. Okay, where the party had completely taken over the state. In Germany, that didn't happen, and that acted as a restriction on Hitler's power. It's what we call structuralism. So intentionalism versus structuralism, that sort of frames our debate. So you can pause the video now, take a moment to look at the notes, jot key points onto either that mind map or that mind map, it doesn't matter which. Okay, so we now move on to the next strand, which is about Hitler's leadership style. Okay, so Hitler's leadership style. And again, there's a few sort of key questions for you to consider here. And it's all really about change. It wasn't a static picture. In the first year and a half of Hitler's rule, his style of leadership was very traditional. But we do see change, particularly after the passing of the Enabling Act. We start to see change. And then we see further change to the way in which he worked after the summer of 1934. And I put a little picture there for you of Hitler's mountaintop retreat, the Obersalzberg in the Bavarian Alps, which was literally hundreds of miles to the south of Berlin, which is sort of a relevant point what we're doing here. Okay. So what are the key points that you need to understand? Well, in the first year of Hitler's chancellorship, he tended to follow the traditional routines of a head of government. Okay, so when Hitler was elected chancellor, 30th of January 1933, he became head of government. So he tended to be like a traditional prime minister. So he lived in Berlin, okay, in the north of Germany. He each day reported to cabinet meetings, and he got a pen in his hand, and whenever laws were passed, he put his signature on the laws. Okay, and certainly in the first few weeks of Hitler's chancellorship, we know that Hitler met with his cabinet often, in the same way as the British Prime Minister meets at 10 Downing Street with the cabinet on a regular basis in England today. So Hitler governed like a traditional first minister. Okay, so we know that his cabinet was a coalition. We know that there were just 3 Nazi ministers there out of 12 ministers. Okay, so we know that Hitler needed to meet with the cabinet, in part to sort of keep the non-Nazis, to persuade them to work with him to pass laws, and in particular he needed to persuade the DNVP, because many of the coalition partners in his first cabinet were members of the German Nationalist Party. We know that Hitler naturally didn't like the formality of meetings, but he had little choice. Okay, so certainly in the first few weeks he met with the cabinet all the time. Although right from the very beginning, you can see in his style of leadership, Hitler never really liked open discussion and debate. So even at this early stage, the cabinet meetings were usually Hitler imposing his will, telling the other people, the other members of the cabinet, what he wanted, and that the final decision would be his. After all, ever since 1920, as leader of the party, that's the way in which he had run the Nazi party, as absolute leader. So he was uncomfortable sort of like in a format where he had to chair meetings and have discussion, but he kind of reluctantly went along with that to some extent. However, on the 23rd of March 1933, as you know, Hitler secured the passing of the Enabling Act. And from that point onwards, of course, the Enabling Act said, well, from now on, Hitler can basically pass laws himself without having to go to the Reichstag. So there was no need anymore within his cabinet meetings to persuade the DNVP ministers to tell their party members to support proposed laws by voting for them in the Reichstag. Hitler can now pass the laws by himself without having to go through the Reichstag. So there's no longer a need for the Reichstag's approval, nor even for the president's signature. Okay, the Enabling Act allows Hitler by himself to pass laws for 4 years. So as a result, Hitler as Chancellor was no longer dependent on his coalition partners. So what does that mean? Actually, there was little point in having cabinet meetings. Hitler had never really liked them anyway, but now the Enabling Act has passed, actually there was little point in having those cabinet meetings. So if they are therefore unnecessary, okay, well, why bother? So logically, less and less, Hitler, when he got up in the morning, he'd be living in Berlin, he wouldn't bother calling a cabinet meeting, he wouldn't bother going to the cabinet meetings. Now, some of the cabinet members complained, the Hugenberg, the Minister of Agriculture, and etc., they complained. We start to see evidence of that. Ministers only finding out about crucial decisions, perhaps because they've listened to the radio or they heard about it in the newspaper, so that they were being increasingly not consulted. Hitler would simply, at a whim, make an announcement that a law was being passed, and he wouldn't talk to the minister who was in charge of that particular area of policy. So there we see there quite early on, after the Enabling Act, a sort of fundamental shift in which Hitler is working. Now that continued through into 1934, so we've obviously done about the events of 1933 and 1934. And what we do know is by August 1934, following the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler's approach to the management of government had significantly changed. So there was a sort of steady shift in the way in which he worked. So by the end of 1934, Hitler showed little interest in day-to-day government. Okay, he really wasn't interested in having conversations about new laws. Instead, he left the detail to the ministers in charge of that area of policy. Okay, he'd say, your job now is simply, it is not to debate or decide. I will tell you what I want the law to be. Your job is simply to draw up the detail of the law and present it to, the man was called Hans Lammers, who was in charge of the Reich Chancellery, who will just get it basically signed off as a new law. So day-to-day laws, Hitler was quite happy to allow his Nazi ministers to work out the details. Once the legislation was drafted, Hitler would read it, often only briefly, because he wasn't really interested in the details, and sign it off. Okay, a scrawled signature, if that, and increasingly even his signature was not attached to laws. So for day-to-day laws, Hitler played no direct role. He simply left it to the ministerial departments to draft the legislation, to work out what the laws were going to be. And pretty much if you were a minister, you had to kind of like second guess what Hitler would want you to do. Now, what that basically meant is the cabinet, which was where the ministers met, or where they were supposed to meet, there was no longer really any need for them to meet, because the purpose of the cabinet is a place where the ministers would gather together and Hitler would sound out their views. But Hitler's not interested in their views. Their job is simply to stay in their ministries and to draft the laws. Why get all the ministers together in one place? There was no point. And we can see that in the evidence. In 1933, the cabinet did meet a lot, in 72 times, but by 1935, it only was meeting 12 times. And often when it met, Hitler wasn't even present. He may send the deputy leader, Rudolf Hess, to meet with the cabinet. So the cabinet therefore became less and less important. And more to the point, because Hitler wasn't interested in basically meeting with his cabinet or talking to his ministers, why even be in Berlin? So from 1934 onwards, Hitler increasingly retreated 400 miles to the south to the Bavarian Alps, and he spent most of his time at the Berghof, in his mountain retreat near the town of Berchtesgaden, which was hundreds of miles away from Berlin. So this is a very, very unusual style of leadership for the head of a government, to simply spend little time in the capital city and to spend most of his time away from the capital city. Okay, so that's Hitler's style of leadership. Key point, it changed over time. Okay, leave you a moment to pause and to make your notes around the edge. Okay, so the key points so far that we've covered. The outdated interpretation from the 1950s, the regime was monocratic, one all-powerful leader, the party had taken over the state, a single well-oiled machine, obedient to Hitler's every command, equals efficient. Since the 1960s, evidence has shown that the regime was polycratic. Many organisations, some Nazi, others not, some from the Weimar era, all competing against each other. Lack of coordination, so the Nazi party versus the state, the army versus the SS, equals chaos, inefficiency. Also, since the 1960s, new evidence has shown that Hitler's style of leadership was unusual. He disliked routine, spent less and less time in Berlin, didn't attend cabinet meetings, disliked paperwork, unusual working hours. The experts often didn't have access to Hitler, had to make decisions without reference to Hitler, equals inefficient and chaos. Okay, those are the sort of key points that we've covered so far. Won't dwell on it, but again, you'll pick it up in all your reading. I mentioned previously he disliked paperwork, unusual working hours. Hitler, based in Berchtesgaden, or the Berghof near Berchtesgaden in the mountains, often he would get up at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So long lions. Spent most of the day just reading the newspaper, walking his dog. Most of the evenings, Hitler watched Hollywood films, and he used to be up until 2, 3 in the morning watching. He used to love Hollywood movies. The key people needed to go to Berchtesgaden, they needed to go to the Berghof to meet Hitler. And so the key to power lay with those people who could access Hitler with this very, very unusual work routine. So how do you actually access Hitler to access what his point of view is, etc.? Okay, so we now move into this area here, reasons why Hitler allowed a polycratic dictatorship to develop, and there are our key questions for you to think about. In what ways was the polycratic system deliberately caused by Hitler? So that's something to think about, deliberately caused. In what ways was the polycratic system a result of Hitler's ideology? And in what ways was the polycratic system a result of Hitler's personality? I've referenced another book by William Carr there, Hitler: A Study in Personality and Politics, which is one of the leading books about how the way in which government worked was an outcome of Hitler's personality. Okay, so what are the key points? So, non-intervention in routine matters, we've established that. Hitler, by 1934, late 34 into 1935 and throughout the remainder of his time as leader, actually spent very little time in Berlin. He wasn't interested in the day-to-day routine matters that normal heads of government would fill their hours with. Okay, so what was the outcome of that? Okay, well, that non-intervention in routine matters meant that it allowed Hitler to focus on what he was interested in. So just be clear, park in your mind for the moment then, what are the key things? Okay, Hitler was interested in rearmament. Okay, so economic matters didn't really interest Hitler. He was bored by economic matters. But he did understand that getting the country to work again, getting the 6 million Germans who were out of work back into jobs was necessary for, you had to get the factories working in order to make weapons, and that rearming Germany was a key strand. Okay, we know that because the longer term goal, in the long term, Hitler of course wanted to expand eastwards to get living space for the German people, and you can't do that unless you've actually got a strong army. And of course the Treaty of Versailles had restricted the size of Germany's army to just 100,000 men. So another kind of medium-term aim was what we call the revision of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, putting on a pretense that he wanted to have the Treaty of Versailles revised, not because he wanted war, because there's no way the Allies would allow the terms of the Treaty of Versailles to be revised if Hitler declared his real intentions, but Hitler argued they needed to be revised because they were unfair. Okay, so just park that information. The next one, Hitler had no real interest in the details of government. Okay, he had no experience in political lawmaking before 1933. His only real experience was in political campaigning for power. And we know that he disliked being tied to routines. His work habits were very, very disorganised. So he's disinterested in details and the routine matters of government. And his daily routines are very unconventional. He would often sleep for most of the day, work through the night. He disliked paperwork. He spent most of the time away from his capital, Berlin, at his home in the Bavarian Alps near the village of Berchtesgaden. So Hitler traditionally, therefore, was more of a sort of Bavarian bourgeois gentleman, sort of like walking the dog in the countryside. That is what he was like. He spent very little time in the capital city in Berlin, following the normal routines of a government leader. Okay. The other thing which was unusual, okay, again, if you're a normal government leader, then it's your job to basically meet with all of your ministers, okay? Now, usually you do that in a cabinet meeting, but as we've already said, Hitler stopped basically calling them together. He didn't meet with his ministers. He simply told them what he wanted to do to some extent, or let them work towards what they thought he wanted to do. But Hitler only really wanted to meet with his favourites. Okay, so Hitler had his favourites, the people who he enjoyed meeting with. Now, probably top of the list of favourites was Joseph Goebbels, who was the Minister of Propaganda. So Goebbels, therefore, spent a lot of time at the Berghof in Bavaria. He was one of the favourites. He was allowed up to the top of the mountain. He spent a lot of time with Hitler. Hitler enjoyed his company. Other favourites, Hermann Goering, okay, the Minister President of Prussia from 1936, put in charge of the 4-year plan to rearm Germany. Himmler, the leader of the SS, who, as we've seen after the Night of the Long Knives, became very, very important. So they were sort of like key ones, and we call these people the plenipotentiaries, okay? They were each put in charge of key areas of policy. Okay, so Goebbels was in charge of propaganda, Himmler was in charge of the police, Goering was in charge of the 4-year plan. And these areas of policy would often sit outside the normal ministries. So, for example, using the example of Goering was in charge of the 4-year plan, which was rearmament, which was to rearm Germany. It was basically the key strand of the German economy. There would still be a Minister of Finance, there would still be a Ministry of Labour, there would still be a Minister of Economic Affairs. They were traditional ministries based in Berlin, but Goering was the plenipotentiary. He was not a normal minister. He could have direct access to Hitler. And so in some ways, although he was not a minister, he was more powerful than a minister because he had direct access to Hitler. So they are the plenipotentiaries. Now, Hitler also applied what we call social Darwinist principles to his style of leadership. Now, we know what social Darwinism is, okay? It's part of Hitler's fundamental ideology, that life was like nature, the law of the jungle, and the nature was ruthless. There was competition, infights, struggle, mein Kampf, my struggle. The word Kampf means struggle. And that struggle was good because when you have struggle and competition, then the strongest will win through and the weak will go under. So in a sense, the fact that you've got competition, so you've got Goering as plenipotentiary for rearming Germany, competing against the traditional ministries, economics, labour, finance, etc. Well, on one level you could say that's inefficient, but on another level, in terms of Hitler's ideology, it is a good thing because competition promotes the struggle between rival groups promotes competition, and out of competition the strongest will emerge. Okay, so the best departments will win through. So you could argue, therefore, that inefficiency in the short term can lead to greater efficiency in the long term. And as time passed, Hitler increasingly believed his own myth that he was all-powerful, all-knowing, and could not make mistakes. So Hitler was constantly being flattered by these people who surrounded him, who were always saying to him, you are all-powerful, you are always right. And so when you're constantly being told you can't ever make mistakes, in the end you start believing that you are all-powerful. So those are all relevant factors. So again, jot down key points. So far we have covered uniqueness, leadership style, and prolificacy. Let's move in now into the outcome, the chaos. So, things to think about. You need to be able to present an argument with supporting evidence that Hitler was not all-knowing. You need to be able to present an argument with evidence that Hitler's personality contributed to the chaos and that was not intended. And you need to be able to present an argument with evidence that the chaos, you could argue, was intentional because it was an outcome of Nazi ideology. And I put a picture there of a man called Robert Lai, who was able to exploit weakness in Hitler's personality to build his own personal power base. So what are the key points? As we said, often the people who were experts, an example of this was Walter Darré. He was the Minister of Agriculture. He wasn't a Nazi. He was the Minister of Agriculture. He spent most of his time in Berlin because the Ministry of Agriculture, all the civil servants who were experts on farming, were based in Berlin. But a perfect example, Darré was not one of Hitler's favourites. So for 2 whole years, the man in charge of agriculture in Nazi Germany never got to see Hitler. There's our point. Some ministers and Nazi officials found it increasingly difficult to access Hitler, to present to him proposed laws that they had drafted. So, out of frustration, Darré would go to this man called Hans Lammers, who would sign off the laws. Okay? Hitler wasn't really interested. Let other people decide how agriculture could be run. Okay? As an example, we've already said Hitler was surrounded by flatterers who would often present him only with the information that he wanted to hear. Now, if you're a real dictator, then you need to know the truth, okay? If you are basically, as the argument goes, so powerful and so feared that everybody who sees you flatters you and tells you what you want to hear, then inevitably you are not going to be told the truth. So you're going to have an increasingly distorted version of reality. So the argument is, therefore, Hitler, although he was dictator, although he was on one level all-powerful, he had the power to make laws by himself, his decisions were based on an inaccurate knowledge and understanding of Germany because he was presented with only the information that he wanted to hear. So that therefore raises the issue, was Hitler really all-powerful? Inevitably, therefore, there were occasions when Hitler made mistakes. Okay, Hitler was, after all, only human. He's been given, to some extent, inaccurate information. We also know that through his own particular style of leadership, he didn't like reading documents. He didn't like meeting the experts. He'd rather be based hundreds of miles away from the capital. So he didn't meet the experts. So inevitably, Hitler made mistakes. But when Hitler did make mistakes, it was impossible for anybody to admit that a mistake had been made. So if a mistake was made, the error would often continue indefinitely. Now here's a very good example of the argument that Hitler was a weak dictator. very famously in October 1933, Hitler, by accident, signed a piece of paper that had been presented to him by Robert Ley. Now, Robert Ley was the man in charge of the German Labour Front. And the piece of paper that Robert Ley gave to Hitler considerably strengthened the bargaining powers of the Labour Front against the employers. Okay, now remember, the Labour Front was an organisation that was to represent the German workers against the bosses. Now, it was never Hitler's intention when he signed that bit of paper to give power to the working classes against the bosses. From Hitler's point of view, the bosses were always the people who should be running the economy. But because Hitler signed it, and because Hitler could not admit that he made a mistake, Ley had that piece of paper, and he would always use it, and he did use it, Robert Ley, to build the DAF into an enormous power base for himself. And Ley used that power base against other Nazis. So you got an example of something happened in Nazi Germany, something grew and became powerful, and it was used to undermine other Nazis, and that was not what Hitler intended. We also know that there were rivalries between different government departments. We've already given examples of that. Wilhelm Frick, the Nazi Minister of the Interior, was a personal rival against Goering, who was the Minister President of Prussia. They competed against each other for control over the police. Goering likewise found himself in intense rivalry with Heinrich Himmler as to who would control the police. Many examples of that. So again, that's further example of, you could argue, social Darwinism, okay, struggle, which fits in with Nazi ideology, with Hitler's ideology. But you could also argue that it's leading to confusion, chaos, inefficiency. What we also know is that Hitler usually declined to take a strong direction. When he saw these rivalries, often between leading Nazis in charge of different Nazi organisations competing against each other, Hitler would usually do nothing and just let them fight it out. And Hitler's line was social Darwinist. The strong will naturally emerge, so I don't need to do anything. Whoever's the strongest will win this battle. So, a characteristic of Hitler's style of government. Okay, so that's the outcome, the chaos. So we've now done those strands. We'll move on now to the Führer's will. So again, you can sort of see the key questions. Okay, evidence that Hitler achieved most of his long-term key political goals. How did personal loyalty ensure that Hitler's will was translated into actions? Why was Hans Lammers arguably the most powerful man in the Third Reich? And explain the concept of working towards the Führer. So we mentioned Hans Lammers, the leader of the Reich Chancellery. Okay, so what are the key points? In spite of this chaotic approach to government, there's no doubt about it, there was chaos. But in spite of that chaos, you could argue that Hitler achieved most of his key political goals. Now, we listed those key political goals earlier. Okay, Hitler was not interested in sort of day-to-day things like agriculture and running of the economy, but he did have key goals. He wanted to create an authoritarian system in which power lay with himself. It happened. Okay, the legal revolution, it happened. He wanted to rearm Germany. It happened. He wanted to dismantle the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, it happened. Okay, the Rhineland was remilitarized in March 36. Austria was Anschlussed in March 38. The Sudetenland was taken from Czechoslovakia in October 1938. All of these things Hitler wanted to happen. It happened. Hitler wanted to expand Germany's frontiers eastwards, at first without war, 1936-8, and then through war, 1939 onwards. Hitler wanted these things to happen. They happened. So, although some historians would argue that there was chaos and Hitler was a weak dictator, there's a strong counter-argument that, well, that chaos is irrelevant because in spite of all of that, what Hitler wanted to happen, happened. And of course, what Hitler wanted to happen was written in the book Mein Kampf that he wrote in the 1920s. So what are the reasons that in spite of that chaos, what are the reasons, how can you argue that Hitler was in control? Now, one of the arguments is that, okay, that although you've got these multiple power bases, these multiple organisations that sit beneath Hitler that are all competing against each other. So you've got Goering in charge of propaganda, Goering in charge of the economy, Himmler in charge of the SS, Robert Lai in charge of the German workers. And although those Nazis are all competing against each other, none of them ever used their power to turn against Hitler. That each of those hugely powerful Nazis, each in charge of a massive organisation, they continued to be overwhelmingly loyal to Hitler throughout the 12 years of the Third Reich. So they may have been fractured, they may have been competing against each other, but they were united by one thing. They were loyal to Hitler and they never used their power bases to challenge him. Also, without clear direction from Hitler, Nazi party officials would seek direction by reading Mein Kampf. Okay, so there was always this book, Mein Kampf. So although Nazi party officials were frustrated because they couldn't actually access Hitler, often because he was distanced in the Berghof, etc., that they could at least get direction by reading effectively the Nazi Bible. And also Hitler's speeches to get a sense of what Hitler would actually want to happen. So for ministers to gain access to Hitler to present their draft laws, they needed to go through this man, Hans Lammers, the head of the Reich Chancellery, which was an office in Berlin. Lammers acted as the filter, okay? So he would read the minister's proposals and he would then have access to Hitler to talk to him about what the ministers were proposing. So ministers therefore had to find favour with Lammers if their legislation was going to gain the final approval from Hitler. So if you were a minister in charge of an area of policy, it was in your interest to work towards what the Führer would want to happen. And Lammers would be the filter. Okay, speaking to the ministers to say, well, this is what Hitler would be in favour of this or Hitler would not be in favour of this. So arguably that made Lammers hugely powerful. Now the argument here is that legislation that was produced in the Third Reich always therefore worked towards what Hitler wanted. Even though Hitler played little or no part in initiating or drafting the laws, Hitler was still in ultimate control. And Lammers, as this loyal head of the Chancellery, possibly the most powerful man in Hitler's Germany, because he controlled access to Hitler. Take a moment then to mind map, either on that first mind map, on that mind map. And we now move into the final strand, okay? Now the German historian Hans Mommsen, picture of him there, was this historian who first used that phrase cumulative radicalisation. So what was it? Why was it inevitable? Why was cumulative radicalisation bound to happen? And can you give examples of cumulative radicalisation in action? Very, very important concept. We've actually already talked about. So let's just go through the key points. So even though this style of government was very chaotic, lots of rivalry, lots of conflict, it clearly had its own dynamic, okay? Hitler, we know, was ideologically very extreme, okay? He wasn't a moderate, he was extreme in his views. When ministers presented their proposals via Lammers to Hitler, if you were a minister, you knew that your proposal was more likely to be accepted if you worked towards Hitler's extreme views. That if you chose to take a cautious stance, which was less likely to be accepted, okay, so you were more likely to gain Hitler's favour and to get Hitler's attention if it was safer to be more extreme, okay, to work towards Hitler's extreme views. So when you've got competition between different departments, all competing against each other for Hitler's attention, departments would try to attract Hitler's attention by outdoing their rivals by introducing legislation that was more and more extreme in its elements. So what you've got therefore are lots of competing agencies, each with chiefs, heads of the agency. There may be ministers or whatever, and they're trying to outdo each other and gain the favour of Hitler. And the best way to do that would be to introduce increasingly extreme laws. So that process I've just described is what Hans Monson called cumulative radicalisation. An example of that would be Nazi policy towards the Jews. Over time, it got progressively more and more extreme. Bit by bit, over the years, the laws got more and more extreme. And yet, there's very little evidence of Hitler doing anything himself. The lawmaking was proposed by other people. It worked towards what Hitler wanted to happen, but Hitler never directly ordered these things to happen, or at least finding a paper evidence that Hitler gave a direct order is increasingly difficult. And that's why Jewish policy has become so controversial. Although we now have indisputable evidence that Hitler did want the Holocaust to happen, and the Holocaust, for example, would not have happened without Hitler. He was central to it. One of the arguments is that Jewish policy worked towards eventually extermination without really requiring Hitler to do anything at all other than to give his nod of approval for decisions that had been made by people beneath him. So apparently Hitler's lack of clear direction didn't really have a detrimental effect. Government still worked towards the will of the Führer. Now that phrase, working towards the Führer, was actually first used by this man, State Secretary in the Agricultural Ministry in 1934, and it was Ian Kershaw who sort of like picked up that particular document and sort of like promoted it in his own book. Okay. So again, pause for note. So that covers our 6 strands: uniqueness, leadership style, polycracy, chaos, Führer's will, and cumulative radicalisation. A reminder then, I've shared the link with you. Once you have completed your mind map in whatever format, okay, or you've written up your notes in whatever format, can you please scan them and then upload them to this document on Padlet, Hitler's Approach to Government. Okay, that needs to be done by Tuesday next week, Tuesday the 4th of June. Finally, our next lesson after this one is another YouTube lesson, okay, and we'll be looking at the relations with the army, Hitler's relations with the army, and the extent of Hitler's power by 1935, another YouTube lesson, okay. So to prepare for that, read the textbook pages 121, 122, check your emails. As soon as I've recorded that YouTube lesson, I will send you an email with a link to the YouTube, and then it'll be exactly the same. Play that video and mind map that lesson from home. I'll give you a hard copy of that mind map when I see you on the 4th of June in that particular lesson, and I'll be setting a deadline for that to be done by the following weekend. That's it. Hopefully that was useful to you. Thank you.